I want to move on to the next of my one of my Leonardo's favorite works, and this is we're coming to your book, The Vitruvian Man. We all seen it, probably one of the most famous pictures, in addition to the Mona Lisa, of course, of Leonardo's work, but The Vitruvian Man. Let's get into that. What's The Vitruvian Man?
So, I mean, the very simple answer to the question is it's the picture of the guy standing in the circle in the square that everybody knows, that you can, it's on the back of the euro coin, a naked male figure with a square and a circle kind of containing his body. It's called Vitruvian Man because Leonardo was in effect illustrating an idea that appeared in the work of a Roman architect named Vitruvius, who was active in the first century, who probably worked under Caesar first and then under Augustus after that, and who was very involved, seems, in the building campaign in Rome that happened in the first century under Augustus. He wrote a book that survives that was very popular and had only recently been kind of revived in a serious way a couple of decades before Leonardo was born, called On Architecture. And that book talks about all sorts of stuff, how to make cement and how to site a city and how to build buildings and all sorts of stuff. But it also has a section devoted to the construction of temples, which were the most sacred and most important kind of building. And in that discussion, he talks about how temples should be built according to the ideal proportions of a human being. And then he talks about the ideal proportions of a human being, and he says that a human body can be fit inside of a circle, and in another way can be fit inside of a square. So there were writers over the course of the centuries after Vitruvius wrote that book that played with that idea. But in the early Renaissance, when Vitruvius became popular again, people started to illustrate that idea, think more seriously about it, and even incorporate some of those ideas into their own architecture as they were trying to revive the architecture of the Romans. So Leonardo, one way or another, at a certain point decided he was going to do his own rendering of the Vitruvian Man. There were others in Italy in the 1400s who had tried it, and a couple of them did images that were pretty similar to what Leonardo did. But that was one of the most interesting things to me about writing the book, was I had sort of assumed that Leonardo just pulled it out of thin air. But in fact, not only was he basing his image on what was written in Vitruvius, but he was also reacting against some of the other attempts to illustrate the image that had come before him. But it's a really interesting image too, because it's a study of proportions. It's kind of an architectural study in a weird way. There are all sorts of facets of it that people typically ignore when they think about it just as a kind of illustration of the perfection of the human body or something like that.
So you wrote this book, Da Vinci's Ghost, the Vitruvian Man. Can you give me a quick summary, and for my audience, people listening to this, what is your book about? And of course, I'll leave a description in the video later where people can go and purchase that book.
It's my attempt to unpack what's in the image and to talk about what Leonardo was up to, which, as we've said in this whole session, was a lot. But what was on his mind at the time he was drawing this image, and how much of what he was thinking about can you actually perceive in this image once you start to think about it in terms that are different from our own present day terms. So I try to discuss all of the different fields that he was most interested in learning about during the period when he drew this image, which was roughly 1490, and that's principally human proportion, the nature of the human body, architecture, and motion. I mean, if you think about that picture, it's a figure that has 4 arms and 4 legs, because he's got some like this, and that actually means that there are all these different possible. You can take one arm up, one arm sideways, one arm like this, and if you flip them all like one of those cartoon books, you can actually set that body in motion. So in an interesting way, I think it's actually a kind of proto-cartoon. He's a study of human motion as well as a study of human proportion, as well as an allusion to the idea of the microcosm and the macrocosm, the human body as kind of a mirror image of what's in the universe in a kind of tiny form. And it's as I said, it's not a literal self-portrait, but it is a portrait of, I think, Leonardo looking at himself as a representative of what the world is and trying to understand. And that's what, like when I look at the face in that picture, I just see him looking at himself, trying to figure himself out, and by extension, figure all of us out and figure everything out.